Hi everyone, thank you for honoring Net Cancer Day with LACNETS and joining us for the 2021 Net Cancer Day Virtual Symposium. Today we are joined by 3 guest speakers, Cindy Lovelace, Josh Mailman, and Dr. Mark Lewis. I'm Lindsey the Director of Communications for LACNETS.
And I'm Lisa Yen. I'm the Program Director for LACNETS.
Before we get started, I'd like to take a second to thank Rich at TVP Live for making today's webinar and high-quality production possible. We'd also like to thank our supporters, Ipsen, Advanced Accelerator Applications, and Novartis. Be sure you're following LACNETS on social media to stay up to date on upcoming webinars and net news. We're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram with the handle @LACNETS. Before I pass it off to Lisa, I'd like to remind our viewers that these online events are done for educational purposes only and do not substitute for medical advice. Please talk to your medical team if you have any questions or concerns about your individual care or treatment. We all have our own opinions, and these are our own opinions. They do not necessarily represent the opinions of LACNETS. And now I'll pass it off to you, Lisa.
Thank you, Lindsey. LACNETS is a program by GeneratePossibility.org, a registered nonprofit, and it stands for the Los Angeles Carcinoid Neuroendocrine Tumor Society. Our mission is to provide education, advocacy, and support for all people impacted by this rare disease that used to be known as carcinoid, an old term meaning cancer-like. The more accurate term is neuroendocrine tumor, or NET for short. You'll often hear us say neuroendocrine cancer as a patient-friendly way to say the official medical term neuroendocrine neoplasm. And we also say neuroendocrine cancer because we understand NET is a type of cancer and not cancer-like or benign as previously thought. While you often see Lindsey and I leading the meetings and programs, we are in fact led by a team that includes our interim administrator and board member, Kavya Velagapudi, and board member Donna Gavin, who is also the sister of LACNETS founder and executive director emeritus, Giovanna Joyce and Basie. Our board also includes Mary Dawn Levy, who is living and thriving with NET for 16 years. Today is a special day. Today is World Net Cancer Day. And World Net Cancer Day is an international event held on November 10th every year to increase awareness about NET, push for scientific advancements, and inspire and provide a voice to the NET community. World Net Cancer Day is personal to us here at LACNETS. Our founder and executive director emeritus, Giovanna Joyce and Basie, always said to us that Net Cancer Day was personal to her since her birthday is the day before. And while it's been almost 2 years since her passing, we will always remember her, and we miss her dearly. We want to honor her with this year's Net Cancer Day Symposium, which focuses on patient advocacy, a topic she cared deeply about. You may wonder, why does World Net Cancer Day matter? Number 1, World Net Cancer Day is for you. For those of you who are affected by NET cancer, whether you're living with the disease or an ally of someone who is, it's a day to bring information and hope to you. Today, our symposium focuses on NET cancer rather than medical information. So if you're looking for information on treatments, research, or other aspects of NET care, we encourage you to check out our YouTube library, podcast, and website. Number 2, World NET Cancer Day is a day to know that you are not alone. People have often shared with us how emotional it was to walk into their first NET cancer conference and see how many people are also living with NET. Even though we're not able to meet in person today, we hope you know that you have a community of people who understand what you're going through and are here to support you and are fighting on your behalf. Number 3, World Net Cancer Day is a day to be empowered and inspired to make a difference. You have a voice and you can make an impact. And this is why we have launched a 3-month challenge. As many of you know, there are often barriers and delays in getting the correct diagnosis and treatment. It can be difficult to get access to NET experts. It can all feel so overwhelming. I know that for me, as my husband and I fight this NET disease together, There are times where I feel helpless or feel like things are outside of my control. Well, here is something you can control. You can be part of the solution by telling 2 healthcare professionals about NET. It can be any healthcare professional, a local physician, nurse practitioner, physician assistant, medical assistant, radiology technician, etc. The goal is to equip healthcare professionals with specific resources. You might help someone else get diagnosed earlier or find the support they need. And now I'll let Lindsey explain the 4 steps you need to take to complete the challenge.
Okay, so there's 4 steps as Lisa mentioned. Step 1, you have to take the pledge by clicking the Take the Pledge button on the challenge page, which the link is listed below, lacnets.org/challenge. Step 2, download the Ask Me About NETS information packet. Whether you are a patient or an ally, there's 2 specific packets that you can download. Step 3, personally deliver, mail, or email the Ask Me About NETS information packet to at least 2 of your local healthcare providers. Step 4, complete the challenge completion form on the challenge page, which is at the bottom. So 4 steps, be sure you do all 4, and the first 20 people will receive a LACNETS tote bag.
That's exciting. Thank you so much, Lindsey.
Yeah.
As we know, today's NET Cancer Day Symposium is focused on patient advocacy, and we hear this word advocacy often in our community. What exactly does it mean? The definition of advocacy is the act of speaking on the behalf of or in support of another person, place, or thing. In healthcare, health advocacy might involve ensuring access to care, navigating the system, mobilizing resources, addressing health inequalities or inequities, influencing health policy, and creating system change. There are different types of advocacy. Self-advocacy, where you advocate for yourself, individual advocacy, where you might advocate for someone else, and systems advocacy, where you influence decisions within political, economic, or social institutions. Today, we will hear from 3 incredible NET advocates who engage in different types of NET advocacy. They are very special, not only because of the amazing work they do, but also because they're friends of Giovanna, and it's an honor to have them here today. First, we will hear from Cindy Lovelace, co-founder and executive director of the Healing Net Foundation, who will share her insights about personal and individual advocacy. Then we will hear from Josh Mailman, president of NorCal CarciNET, whose advocacy work includes serving on several advisory boards, and he works to influence research, health policy, and systems change. Lastly, we will hear from Dr. Mark Lewis, NET oncologist from Intermountain Healthcare in Salt Lake City, Utah, who is also living with a genetic form of NET called MEN1. He is very active in spreading awareness and kindness through his use of social media. Let's first welcome Cindy Lovelace.
Hi, I'm Cindy Lovelace, and I'm living with PNET. And as a result of that, I became a patient advocate for myself and also for the community at large. I wanted to help others who have been diagnosed with NET cancer. So I'm calling my talk with you today, Navigating a NET Cancer Journey and Living Life with Joy. So I live a pretty active life in Old Hickory, Tennessee, near Nashville. I hike and I sail with my husband, and we enjoy a lot of travel. We also spend time with our extended family, from East Coast to West Coast, which includes 4 children and 5 grandchildren. And in the midst of that, I work full-time and deal with a life-threatening disease. Actually, I have 2 cancer diagnoses, breast cancer in 2004 and neuroendocrine in 2011. While I've had my share of downtime with surgeries, treatments, and such, I try really hard to prevent NET cancer from defining my whole life. I focus on those things that I can do something about, supported by my family and my friends, and also other NET patient caregivers, advocates, and I also lean on my personal faith. I try to plan as much or more joy in my life than I do the difficult times. Now, all of us have different ways of trying to cope with downtimes, and I think it's really important to intentionally do that. Well, back to my initial NET diagnosis and what I've learned about patient advocacy for myself and for others. Now, this tumor was found by accident, or to use the correct terminology, incidentally. I did not have any symptoms. I presented at the ER a few weeks after breaking my little toe, and I was experiencing pain and swelling in my leg, and I was feeling quite exhausted. The scans revealed that I was afflicted with blood clots in my leg, which had moved up into my lungs and filled my lungs. And I was feeling pretty darn lucky at that point that I was in the ER. Well, my doctor surmised that because I had been taking an estrogen blocking drug for my breast cancer treatment, and that blood clots were a lesser known side effect, they figured that the long-term use of the medication had probably caused the DVT in my leg. So it turns out that was only partially correct. There was something else going on. Fortunately, I had directed that all of my scans and my report from that ER visit be sent to my oncologist, my breast cancer oncologist. And as she flipped through them a month later at a routine office visit, she inquired about the technician's notation regarding a small, suspicious shadow in the area of my pancreas. And I learned my very first important patient advocate lesson here. I did well to have the report sent to my oncologist, but I should have also requested a copy of those scans for myself, and also the report from the doctor interpreting the scan. Educating yourself is just as important as the education of your doctor, and we'll talk more about that later. My breast cancer oncologist ordered follow-up scans, and she referred me to a gastroenterologist to figure out what might be going on. And I ultimately had an endoscopic ultrasound, which revealed a neuroendocrine tumor. Now, I had to practice that quite a while and learn to spell it. And I was certainly not pleased when my oncologist told me that she really didn't know much about neuroendocrine tumors, that they were rare. And so I was told by my physician doing the ultrasound that I shouldn't worry about it, that neuroendocrine tumors are almost always benign, until I got the phone call that it was not. And so I was also told that the report showed that the tumor was in my stomach. Turns out that was wrong too. So armed with all this confusing information, I was referred to a surgeon who scheduled me for a resection. So it turns out he didn't know much about neuroendocrine tumors either, but he was a really crack surgeon. When he went in to remove the tumor from my stomach, he discovered that it wasn't there. And so he didn't give up. He used his surgeon hands to go through all the organs in that vicinity until he found a small tumor in the tail of my pancreas. And then I had half my pancreas removed, along with several lymph nodes and my spleen, and I was pronounced cancer-free. Go live your life. So I learned another important lesson in patient advocacy. Ask a lot of questions. Follow up with your own research. Maybe even seek a second opinion. Turns out I was not cancer-free. 6 months later, in October 2011, a CNN report changed my life and my neuroendocrine cancer path. I learned that Steve Jobs had just died from neuroendocrine cancer, which began in, guess where, his pancreas, and it had metastasized to his liver. Who knew? I didn't. And his case sounded disturbingly like mine, except I was cancer-free, right? No one had ever mentioned that even a small neuroendocrine tumor, resected with clear margins, could spread. It was a revelation that sent me to Google again, and I learned there was a neuroendocrine center in my city that my oncologist didn't know about. However, she did know the doctor. Their families actually socialized together, but she had no idea that he was treating neuroendocrine patients. So my first visit with this expert doctor made me feel like I had struck gold. So much information that I did not know before. And I was sent to have a liver MRI, and it showed nothing remarkable. However, this physician recommended a gallium-68 scan. Later, I figured out that I was one of the first group of people in the US to actually have this scan in this country through a clinical trial. It showed 2 tumors in my liver, A resection of 1 confirmed mid-grade neuroendocrine cancer. So another lesson in patient advocacy: do research and also check on clinical trials. There's a lot of hope on the horizon. So let me pause here and say that it was not until I started attending patient conferences. The first one was actually a national conference put on by NCAN. And then I started looking at their resources. And then I noticed other organizations that were holding informational conferences and had resources on their websites. And I found that these were really vetted and had really good information about neuroendocrine that I would not find on other more typical cancer-related websites like American Cancer Society. And so NCAN, LACNETS, NorCal CarciNET, the Carcinoid Cancer Foundation, Neuroendocrine Tumor Research Foundation, or NetRef, and now HealyNet Foundation, all organizations that have really good information specifically about neuroendocrine cancer. And it goes way above and provides more accurate information than other more common cancer websites like cancer.org or the American Cancer Society. And there's also a lot of online support groups that offer really helpful information as well. But it was not until I really started digging into understanding my disease that I could understand why some people would say carcinoid and other people would say neuroendocrine. I didn't know what grading meant. I didn't know what Ki-67 meant. I didn't know what somatostatin analogs were and how they worked. It was important for me to educate myself. I can't stress enough the importance of educating yourself, but also not depending on what Google finds. Hey, I got lucky with that CNN report. Online, you can find organizations I mentioned and others you can trust to provide you with good vetted information from NET expert physicians and also from NET patients. So here's the boxes that I've checked in the last 10 years and how my advocacy journey has moved forward. So my initial surgery was a distal pancreatic resection and splendectomy, followed a year later by a tumor resection of my liver, and a few years after that, a more robust debulking of my liver with several tumors removed from my mesentery and a resection of my gallbladder. The lessons I learned about surgery: well, ask a lot of questions in advance and prepare yourself physically and mentally. Understand your insurance policy and double check that everyone who will be taking part, from the surgeon to the anesthesiologist to the pathologist, is covered. Surround yourself with trusted people, caregivers who can step in and do specific tasks for you. Take rest and recovery very seriously. Call the doctor if something doesn't feel right. And inject humor wherever possible.
Hi, I'm Dr. Clown. 50 cc's of silly coming your way.
So that really happened, and thanks to while I was having surgery or prepping for surgery, and thanks to my comedian daughter for that little episode there. Well, to follow up on an earlier patient advocacy lesson learned regarding your own copy of scans and reports, I also recommend that you request a copy of your pathology report after surgery or biopsy. And I've also had my share of waiting and monitoring. I am monitored with a combination of MRIs and PET dotatate scans. I learned that the type of scan you have, where you have it, and who reads it is also important. If you can consistently do it at the same center, that is optimal, but that's not always possible. But you can get the right scans. And I've endured the monthly somatostatin analog injections, and I've learned that I don't need to settle for shots that are not administered correctly. If the nurse giving the shot can't answer a basic question about what he or she is doing, or you end up with a really sore butt and a big lump, you are not getting optimal treatment. Insist that they watch the video or the manufacturer's website, or at least read the instructions that come with the box. Don't settle for, oh, I've given lots of butt shots. They are not the same. I've also had systemic treatments, 4 rounds of Lutathera PRRT, and currently I'm on Captem. I've learned how important it is to have a team of experts on my side when making treatment decisions. I currently have at least 3 physicians on my multidisciplinary team: a surgeon, oncologist, and nuclear medicine physician, and all are NET experts. That team could look differently depending on where you live and what access you have to NET experts. But at a minimum, I would suggest that your local doctor must be willing to seek answers and advice from someone who is a true NET expert. And this is not hard for your doctor to access. Most of the NET experts I know are more than willing to do this. Building trust with a team of doctors is so important because while we are blessed to have lots of treatment options now and more coming down the road, it requires trust in your team to feel confident that you are going in the right direction. That trust helps me live my life knowing I will have periods of stabilization and periods of possible progression. I accept that I am not cured of NET cancer, but I know I have a team of NET experts who monitor my disease and have knowledge of options that are available for me and my unique path. I mentioned earlier that I work full-time. Well, that work has changed a lot since I was diagnosed with neuroendocrine cancer. I had a long radio career as a news reporter and on-air announcer, and then in promotions and marketing. So after 30 plus years of being immersed in communications, I entered the nonprofit sector to run fundraising events for a National Cancer Research Foundation. In 2011, that Steve Jobs story on CNN that prompted a random Google search and led me to a NET expert in my own city, well, that guy was Eric Liu. And we didn't just talk about me. We began talking about what we each did. And just maybe, if we worked together as a patient and a doctor, each with that perspective, then maybe we could figure out ways to change the paradigm of patients struggling for years to get diagnosed, or to get the right answers and then the right treatment, to receive optimal care in an optimal timeline. So, the founding of the HealingNet Foundation began in 2013. And 8 years later, our organization has grown to a focus on education and collaboration, particularly on education of physicians, nurses, and healthcare providers, as well as resources vetted by the medical experts and written by patients themselves to help each of you better navigate this unique and challenging NET cancer journey. We have joined other organizations I mentioned earlier in trying to fill all the gaps of NET care. And we want each of you to live your life the best you can. I want to make a point here that I don't see myself as particularly special as I've grown into this field of advocating for myself and advocating for others. I simply paid attention to what was happening to me, and I related it to others and how it might impact them. And then when I found myself in a place where just maybe I could take what I had learned so far from my career and my cancer diagnosis and my life in general and do something good with it, I took a leap. I learned from others who were already advocates. I learned from NET experts who I must say love talking about what they know. And I learned from many other patient stories. I listened and read a lot at first. And then as I learned, I built upon my own communication skills to tell my story in a way that I hoped others could relate to it and maybe learn something helpful. Even beyond HealingNet Foundation, I will be advocating the rest of my life for better awareness, education, and collaboration so that NET patients can receive optimal care. And as you look to set intentions in your life, find ways to cope and to find joy, you can advocate as well in ways that fit you. First, you must educate yourself. Choose doctors who are educated and willing to be educated, and build that trust with them. Find support in your family, in friends, other patients, caregivers, and advocates. And then you will likely have to take a little bit of a leap yourself by telling your own story in various ways or becoming an active volunteer. But that leap just might be the way that you do find joy and that you learn to cope with a NET cancer journey. So we're going to be doing some questions and answers today, but here's my email contact information and our website again. And if you want to reach out to share your story or find a way to be an advocate, we can start a dialogue. Thank you, and I'll leave you with a piece of joy that I try to experience as much as possible. This is a gorgeous sunset on Old Hickory Lake in Tennessee. Thank you.
Thank you, Cindy, for your inspiring presentation. Now we will hear from Josh Mailman.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending where you are in this virtual world. My name is Josh Mailman. I'm the president of NorCal CarciNET community, and we're here to talk a little bit about patient advocacy and how you can help bring about change. Again, here's our agenda. I want to give you kind of ideas, probably beyond the role of just advocating for yourself, but advocating for others in patient advocacy and what that entails and what can be accomplished. Through this presentation, I'm going to use a bunch of acronyms, and I'll try to say them when I do them, but in case I don't, here's an acronym slide that you can take a quick look at of things that I work in and work on, so you get an idea of the acronyms that I may use during this presentation. With most patient advocates, we're patients first, and that's true of me as well. I'm a pancreatic neuroendocrine tumor patient. I was diagnosed in 2007. I've had several rounds of PRT in Germany in 2009 and 10, follows on in 2016 and 20. And at a point when I was doing really well, I asked my oncologist this silly question. I asked, how could I help? And that question has gotten to me in a lot of challenges, because one of the challenges that one has as being an advocate is learning when to say no. But at that point, I asked that question, how can I help? And she pointed me towards patient advocacy or towards helping others as opposed to helping yourself. I mean, we can all advocate on behalf of ourselves for treatment and other things. And I know that there's speakers that are talking today about how to advocate for yourself, but this is how to advocate for others, how to improve care for others. So patient advocacy is an area of specialization in healthcare concerned with advocacy for patients, survivors, and caregivers. Well, that's a definition where you can really drive a truck through. So I really like this drawing from a friend of mine, Deb Collier, from the CARE, the Patient Advocates and Research, which kind of looks at patient advocacy as a jigsaw puzzle. There's the support, which we know we get from LACNET, and fundraising, which we get from LACNETS or NetRF or other organizations. But then there's political advocacy, there's research advocacy, there's policy advocacy in being, a watchdog or a patient's rights. So if we look at that, advocacy really is one phrase. We say patient advocate, but what does that mean? It's many hats. Sometimes it's an organization that does advocacy, sometimes it's an individual, but really it's an individual or a group that's really providing advocacy services. And they don't just have to be for the individual patients, right? We have advocates who work in policy to get more funding for clinical trials or better payment for existing treatments. So these are typical advocacy activities looking back towards that jigsaw puzzle that we had before. You could do awareness building, as I've talked about, which both my group, NorCal CarciNET Community, LACNETS, NCAN, several others do about neuroendocrine tumors. We can do support and education of patients, much like all of our programs that we talk about. Some type of advocacy is doing patient representation, where we can actually go with patients to their appointments and help them advocate on their behalf. Recently, I was appointed as the patient's right advocate for the Nuclear Regulatory Commission's Advisory Committee for the Medical Use of Isotopes. And in that kind of position, you're representing patients and what's in the patient's best interest when you're thinking of policy. We talk about matters of privacy, and sometimes that's coupled with informed consent, where we're looking at both your data, how information about you is shared, and also about informed consent to make sure things that happen in a clinical trial may not go beyond where you want them to go. In reality, patient advocates that do more than personal advocacy give a voice to patients, survivors, and carers. A lot of you may know me from being working in nuclear medicine, and why I got involved in nuclear medicine. I like to show this is actually I was invited to the first World Congress on Gallium-68 in Bad Berka, Germany in 2011. I don't know if I consider myself a global advocate at that point, but I was one of a couple of patients. And what I saw very quickly was this type of advancement, all these different types of new peptides that were going to be used across from things like prostate cancer and breast cancer and other things outside of neuroendocrine tumor. I got really interested in how we could help promote and also help with the explosion of what was going to happen in the nuclear medicine industry. And that's coming to fruition now. We're starting to see, we saw our first approvals for PSMA imaging, and we'll see ones for therapy using much the same things we do for neuroendocrine tumors. So research and policy advocacy is different than personal advocacy. Really, this is learning about conflicts of interest, learning how to present what is right for the entire community, just not advocating for yourself. Luckily, I was onboarded by the Patient Advocacy Steering Committee of the National Cancer Institute, which has trainings that help you through this process and learning the language of trials. And some of these things are online. And right now, it's better than ever as far as the amount of training. And I'll talk about that at the end. But many of the cooperative groups and large advocacy agencies now conduct trainings to help advocates understand what's going on. Now, some of you may not even know what a cooperative group is, and that's your research institution or even your community center is a member of a clinical trials cooperative group that works to put out clinical trials into their groups. And these are 1,000 centers, cooperative groups that can then really get out clinical trials. I showed this book, When Science Offers Salvation. It's by a woman named Rebecca Dresser. And it's a really good read if you're thinking about getting into research advocacy, because it talks about and goes through the history of patient advocacies from the early times in the breast cancer movement, in the AIDS movement, and really gives a guidepost for how to look at this inside your own world and inside your own disease, and what are the guide rails that you should be looking at. And yes, actually, we've studied this, and it's really good. The Patient Centered Outcome Research Institute has put money behind putting patients as a stakeholder in research. And as a matter of fact, not only have they spent over $320 million, they have put all of their data online so you can search to see how patients can impact things. So where do I spend my time? How do I keep up to date? And where am I, if you take a look at that jigsaw puzzle, where do I fit inside of that, and what type of activities do I do, both to keep up to date and to advocate? And I've kind of done this a lot like that jigsaw puzzle, right? I work in support, awareness, and fundraising. I'm the president of NorCal CarciNET. I work with the Society of Nuclear Medicine. I was their inaugural chair of patient advocacy. I'm a board member of the Neuroendocrine Tumor Research Foundation and the Education and Research Foundation for Nuclear Medicine. And I help run the World Association of Radiopharmaceutical and Molecular Therapy. I do a lot on the research end. As I said, I'm a member of the NCI, originally a member of the Task Force for Neuroendocrine Tumors, but as my skill set has increased, I was elected 4 years ago and am now in my second term as a member of the Steering Committee for GI Cancer. I am the only non-breast cancer patient advocate for the ASCO Scientific Research Committee. I'm a member of the faculty on how to actually teach clinical research to young investigators. It's called the VAIL Workshop. And I'm a member of the NETSPOR. I'm the patient advocate for the NETSPOR. This is something from the University of Iowa that actually puts out a lot of research funding across the neuroendocrine tumor space. And I've been fortunate to serve on guideline committees. In the regulatory framework, I am one of 160 FDA patient representatives that help when there is a question on whether a drug should be approved or not, or how to write the label. And as I said previously, I'm a member of the advisory committee on the medical use of isotopes. I serve as the patient's right advocate, where I represent patients. And you know, what do you do on things like on advisory committees? So here's an example. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission is rethinking or updating the release criteria for those who are having some type of nuclear medicine therapy. And so I may, from my vantage point and from the vantage point of talking to other patients, bring up concerns that patients have about having nuclear medicine therapy, something like PRT or PRLT for prostate cancer, and make sure that they're addressed in the guidelines as opposed to or in the release criteria, instead of just having physicians who may not know that you may want to spend time with your animals, for instance, your dogs and cats, and that's important to put in the release criteria, and so that we have better understanding of how we can do that, just for instance. But mostly, much like many of you, I listen to fellow patients' journeys and challenges. And that's how I inform my advocacy as well. And you'll see me online asking questions about I'm giving a presentation or I've got to go testify in some forum. And I want to hear from other patients as well so I can bring your viewpoint forward. So where are opportunities to engage? There's so many places. We'll talk about it in a bit, but the FDA, EMA is the European Medical Agency, the National Cancer Institute, for instance, PCORI, which we've talked about, the cooperative groups, they all offer different ways to engage that you can become, work with the FDA or work with the NCI, and they will work with you to teach you the types of things you'll need to know for this area. So the good news is there's a rich history of patient engagement. We really are on the shoulders of others. Those in the breast cancer world, in the AIDS world, they really set the groundwork for patient advocacy and bringing patients to be involved in research, in policy, in other areas. So we weren't just the patient. We were actually an active participant in our care. We really do have willing partners, which is really great. But we really do need to also support our researchers as well, not to always look at how we can do, but there's many ways to get involved, not only with your time, but also direct support of people who are supporting those who give us care. Patient participation in research can lead to better outcomes, which is great. My new term, which I'm sure I'm going to talk to Mark Lewis here in a little bit, is called COOL, which is not only quality of life, but it's quantity and quality of life. So that's my new acronym, QQOL. So it will bring along better outcomes over time. So remember, a lot of these things aren't instantaneous. It takes time to get things changed. Can you make an impact? As I was talking about, I do things with clinical young investigators in helping them with their clinical designs. And just like we have surveys after this type of webinar, I survey those who are in my classes and I ask them, has working with a patient advocate changed how you think of patients? And you get some of these quotes on that, we need to be involved early on and it should be continuous fluid, not a one-time check-in, which interestingly enough, I had a conversation with a pharma partner earlier this morning and it was very much of, right now what we do is after everything's done, we show it to a patient and say, is this good? And if it's not good, it's been too late because we didn't involve them in the entire process. And we discussed how they can change that. So we've talked about, advocacy in different organizations, but even advocacy tools. And this is Giovanna and Lisa and Dr. Lee talking about Net Vitals. I mean, here was an opportunity that came out of a meeting with Healing Nets with Cindy Lovelace in San Diego that Giovanna ran with to see if we could figure out how to bring information forward. And so this is a really great we created tools here that are patient advocate driven. And you can advocate beyond NETs. Now, whether you want to do this with ASCO or for nuclear medicine or for different things, there are so many different ways to advocate on behalf of other patients and that are beyond NETs as well. So I'm not sure where to start. First thing is learn how to tell your story so that when you advocate in front of either other patients or other medical providers or in front of your legislative representatives, you can tell a quick, concise story. LACNETS is a great place to start and work with. Obviously, there's the Net Connect team as well. There's national organizations that would be happy to help you. Or look under cancer cooperative groups, and you'll see they all have pages on patient advocacy. You can see which group the center you're cared for is actually involved in. This just came out yesterday, as a matter of fact. Introductions to Principle and Practice of Clinical Research. This is a free online course that after you're done, you will get a certificate that says, I actually understand how to do clinical research. So for those of you who are interested, if you use this link here to bit.ly/netadvocate, you'll be able to actually sign up. And when there are opportunities that I see, I hit this list and let them know what's going on so that they can participate in different opportunities that show up for patients. So with that, I want to thank you. I look forward to the question and answer happening soon, and look forward to meeting with you in person when we get out of this flat screen earth.
Thank you, Josh, for your excellent presentation and practical tips. Now we will hear from Dr. Mark Lewis.
Hello, my name is Mark Lewis. I am a medical oncologist at Intermountain Healthcare in Salt Lake City, Utah. And the other thing you should know about me is I am a NET patient myself. So I'll be speaking to you today about NET advocacy in the modern era, giving you my perspective from sort of both sides of the exam table. So let's start with the journey of the NET patient. I think one of the unique challenges that I see in my practice, and I take care of all different types of gastrointestinal cancer, is this sense of not being recognized for what you have. So we all know that the zebra is the mascot of the neuroendocrine tumor patient, but I wanted to explain where that zoological association comes from. So in our medical training, the adage that we're taught as students is when you hear hoofbeats, think horses, not zebras. And what that means is in medical school, we're taught about almost literally every illness, but our instructors, our professors, our attendings want to focus our attention on the things that are most common. Ergo, horses are more common than zebras. However, if you just think about horses, you're going to miss zebras. And as we'll discuss, in aggregate, we form, I think, a fairly impressive herd. The other thing that doesn't help, if I'm honest, is the name of neuroendocrine tumors. So, Shakespeare said, what's in a name? That which we call a rose by any other name would smell as sweet. I wonder if neuroendocrine tumors by any name other than carcinoid might be more comprehensible and better understood in the medical community. So let's start with carcinoid. This is a misnomer that has existed in our community now for over a century. And it begins with this gentleman. This is Dr. Siegfried Oberndorfer. He was a brilliant pathologist practicing in Germany, in Munich, in the early 20th century. And he made a seminal discovery, which he was examining patients. And this sounds morbid. He was doing post-mortem exams. And in roughly one in several hundred autopsies that he was performing, and he was doing very meticulous work, he would find these tiny, tiny tumors, typically in the small intestine. And he couldn't discern that the tumors had spread. And also under the microscope, like you can see there, he's peering down the lens, they didn't have the classic appearance of a cancer. And so he decided that the proper term here would be carcinoid, which is as close as we can get translating the German to English, the meaning cancer-like. The problem is, and Oberndorfer actually realized this before the end of his life, he was a Jewish scholar, and he had to leave Germany during the Third Reich and actually live the rest of his life in Istanbul. Before he died in the 1940s, he tried to fix this misnomer, but unsuccessfully, and it's a term that has stayed with us ever since. What he wanted to avoid was it being interpreted as uniformly benign, because even he realized shortly after the genesis of this term that that was not the case, that these tumors could spread and they could cause significant problems to patients, both in terms of quality of life and longevity. So I'm also going to invoke another titan in the history of neuroendocrine tumors. I don't know if this name is as well known to NET patients as perhaps it ought to be, but Dr. Charles Mortel was a titan in the field of GI oncology who practiced at the Mayo Clinic, largely, I believe, from the 1970s to the 1990s. And in 1987, he gave this brilliant lecture. It's actually one of my favorite scientific papers of all time, called An Odyssey in the Land of Small Tumors. And he specifically was drawing attention to the under-recognized plight of the neuroendocrine tumor patient. And he had a beautiful turn of phrase. This was not dry scientific jargon. This was full of verve. So he said, these patients have a natural history of disease like no other. They present in an almost serialistic manner a mix of tumor-related symptoms and signs with bizarre and sometimes grotesque endocrine syndromes. Certainly, they are only rarely encountered, but as specialists in oncology, it's our responsibility to understand the less common diseases. The privilege of caring for a patient with a gastrointestinal neuroendocrine tumor is one to be savored. So clearly, this man was advocating for us. And then what's interesting is when you try to take the experience of each individual patient and quantify that, look at that in aggregate, indeed, there are a whole host of different symptoms that a neuroendocrine tumor syndrome can present with. As you know, like a variety of mimics. So the diarrhea of carcinoid syndrome can look like irritable bowel syndrome. The flushing can look like, especially in a woman, can look like perimenopausal hot flashes. The wheezing can be mistaken as asthma. But when you put that all together, what that means is if you're accruing these incorrect labels, there is a significant time delay to onset of symptoms and proper labeling. And that time delay can last years. In this aggregate study, it lasted 53.8 months, so about 4.5 years. And indeed, I think if you look among our community, I think you'll find some people had a mercifully brief journey to diagnosis, and some people had years, sometimes even decades, of suffering the symptoms and not knowing what was wrong with them. And this is, again, something that Dr. Mortel realized. So among doctors, I have to be honest with you, there is a sense that patients should not be going to the internet to research their own illness. However, I have to tell you, I think that is an entirely natural, and I would argue, depending on where you go, appropriate thing to do. So let's look at cancer patients in general. Most cancer patients, the vast majority, use the internet to search for information about cancer following their diagnosis. 94% of them search on Google. And these are the results they tend to get back. So the most accurate findings a Google search will give you is about the cause of your disease, although this is not a net-specific finding because, as we know, the cause of many nets is elusive. And then about symptoms, about 2/3 of the search results will be accurate. Where the least accurate information arises is prevention, treatment, and prognosis. So it's very easy to get a skewed view of your likely outcome by using Google. There are trade-offs between readability and reliability. As a general rule, the simpler the language is, the less reliable the scientific conclusions might be. And this is fascinating for our community. Patients with rarer cancers are particularly vulnerable to the surfacing of misinformation. Remember that Google is a search engine, and search engine optimization can be gamed such that results that rise to the top are trying to sell you something, and not always something that's going to help you. Searching about specific medications will lead to pharmaceutical websites about 1/5 of the time. And I'm not saying that that's an unreliable source, but those websites typically exist not just for educational purposes, but for marketing purposes, again, trying to sell your product. So Google, the elephant in the room. It launched in September of 1998. It's now so omnipresent that we forget there was a time where it wasn't around. And within a year of its inception, 1 billion searches per year were being performed. By 2000, more than half of Google users had searched for health information at least once. So very early in the adoption of this search tool by the public, more than half of its users were looking up health information. That just shows you what a natural instinct that is. As of 2019, more than 2 trillion annual searches were performed, of which 7% were health related. So when you do the math there, that's more than 70,000 such queries per minute. And this is fascinating to me. So patients know themselves. Health-related searches double in the weeks before a patient goes to the emergency room, and about half of patients who use Google in the week prior to going will actually search for content that's directly related to their chief complaint. So I tell my students, my trainees all the time, the patients know what is wrong. They just need us to put the appropriate label on it and then treat them accordingly. So again, there is some disdain, some discomfort, if I'm honest, among healthcare professionals about this practice. I am not fond of this mug, but you can buy this. Doctors have bought this. It says, "Please do not confuse your Google search with my medical degree." And you can tell here there is some irate reaction that we would go through all these years of training and presumably accrue wisdom through experience, and people would conflate that with what you get back from a Google search. And there's also, if I'm honest, a lot of negative PR for oncologists in particular on Google. So a couple years ago, I did a little exercise. You might know that Google will often auto-complete your search string to try to help you. So I put in the search string "oncologists are," and I let Google do the rest. And it said oncologists are murderers, oncologists are evil, oncologists are confused, and oncologists are criminals. So maybe, and I'm not saying pity your poor doctor, you can start to see why physicians have a slightly skeptical view, shall we say, of what we get back from Google. However, there is a dirty little secret, and that is that doctors use Google too. This is an example of, again, a doctor who has demonstrated the utmost umbrage to Google. So what's happening here is there's I believe a senior rheumatologist who is just absolutely affronted that a trainee would use Google to arrive at the correct diagnosis. And again, this man may not be familiar to you. This is Sir William Osler. He is often venerated as one of the greatest physicians, certainly in the American medical tradition. And he was a master diagnostician. And he was making his brilliant deductions long before Google was available. And this doctor, writing in 2005, was sort of envisioning that Sir William Osler would be turning over in his grave that we would use these modern information tools. But we do. So this was a fascinating survey performed several years ago now that asked 300 members of the American Medical Association, how often do you use the following resources to gain information to diagnose, treat, and care for patients? And look at this. Google comes in at number 3 on the list. How about that? Doesn't that seem hypocritical? But what I also found interesting is at number 2, just after professional journals as sort of the ultimate source of evidence-based literature, colleagues, our peers, were the second most likely source to go to for information. And I would argue that patients do the same thing. We go to like-minded, kindred spirits and ask them questions, just the same thing that happens in the physician community. We're people too. We have this human instinct to seek out our peers and ask them their opinion. And that outranks even search engines among how doctors arrive at their conclusions. So social media, I will be honest, I may be a little bit of an outlier here in that I have readily embraced social media in my personal and professional life. A lot of doctors fear to tread on social media. And again, it comes from a good place. I've already showed you what can happen on Google. Social media is a place where it's actually very easy for a doctor to stray and say accidentally disclose personal health information, which is a massive and arguably fireable offense. So many of my peers, and I don't blame them, have decided, you know what, I'm not going to have any professional presence on social media. And I respect that. However, I think it has to be recognized that social media is where many patients are congregating. And this is probably apocryphal, but I love the story anyway. So when the FBI finally located the famed bank robber, Willie Sutton, they said, hey, why do you rob banks? And he said, that's where the money is. And I would argue, especially during COVID, the nature of the pandemic has forced us into these virtual spaces to congregate with one another. So let's take a look at that. So Facebook, the elephant in the room. Obviously not a social media platform that is devoid of scandal, and yet I don't think you can have a discussion about social media and neuroendocrine tumors in 2021, as I record this, without mentioning Facebook. It is still, I think, the dominant presence. So of the public posts on Facebook, this is shocking to me, 7.5% are health related. I think it's very easy to sort of caricature Facebook as though it's updates from your high school friends and baby pictures, but there is a lot actually of information on Facebook that people are disclosing about their own health, and that's in the public forums. Once again, the patients will tell you what is happening with them, and in our somewhat demonstrative modern way, you can see this activity even on social media. So there were linkage studies to look at ER visits in relation to social media posts, and patients with a given diagnosis in our electronic medical record were far more likely to use terms related to that condition on Facebook. Patients will self-disclose signals about their mental and physical health. So these are word clouds around particularly depression and loneliness. And again, this is natural language processing, which is bringing these linguistic signals, these red flags, out of Facebook posts. So the signal is there if you care to listen to it. Somewhat troublingly, for a medical oncologist who does believe in evidence-based medicine and believes in research as the engine of progress, fewer than 1% of all these health-related posts concern clinical trials or research studies. So there's a lot of anecdotal evidence and very, very little actually strong peer-reviewed evidence is being cited on Facebook. So buyer beware. I'm a big believer in destiny sharing. Part of my diagnosis with a very rare neuroendocrine tumor syndrome was actually to co-found and co-moderate a Facebook group for patients with my syndrome. So I have multiple endocrine neoplasia type 1. It has an incidence of about 1 in 30,000 in the United States, which means that when I was diagnosed, I didn't know anybody like me. And by happenstance, I met at the Mayo Clinic where I was training one other person who had my diagnosis, and together we decided that we needed to have a digital presence. What's been fascinating to me over the years is with all the different reasons not to be on Facebook, whether that's Cambridge Analytica or leaks of information or the data being used for sale. And as Mark Zuckerberg has very freely admitted, Facebook sells ads. It is not a completely free charitable service. With all of that, the attrition from our group has been very, very little. So this happened now, several years ago. There was a group for BRCA survivors, so usually women with the BRCA mutation who'd been affected by breast and ovarian cancer, and they joined a private group on Facebook with the understanding that in that private group, their own identities, which again are tied to a genetic condition, would not be disclosed. And again, I'm not entirely sure there was any malice here by Facebook, but it turns out a relatively simple plugin in the Chrome browser allowed you to see the list of these patients' names, which was a huge sort of breach of the privacy that they understood that they had. So even with that, among health communities, Facebook is often seen as too important to delete. And indeed, this is my own group, American Multiple Endocrine Neoplasia Support. Over the last several years, we've only seen about a 2% attrition in membership because I think NET patients like us, we find a real kinship online. I think there is value there. You just have to be aware of the trade-offs. You have to be aware of the trade-offs in the information you're receiving. And you also have to realize that what you take to be completely private may not be so. What about Twitter? So this is actually the platform where I feel most comfortable, and certainly where most physicians, if they're going to be online at all, will be found and will be active. So this is my Twitter profile. I am extremely upfront that I am a neuroendocrine tumor patient. That banner photo is actually a picture taken of me on the very morning of my Whipple procedure, right before I was wheeled into the operating room. So I think it's actually more important that I advertise I'm a patient, necessarily even than I advertise that I'm a physician, although you can see there my professional affiliations. This is what's really interesting to me also. As an oncologist, and I think you should know this about the doctors that might be taking care of you, Twitter has been gaining traction even before the pandemic. This is crucial. So the inflection point actually happened, I would say, in our professional community in 2019. So every year, every summer, usually in Chicago pre-COVID, all the oncologists from around the world would congregate in a massive sort of hangar-like convention center there, McCormick Place. And what happened in 2019 is we saw this upswing in oncologists using Twitter to communicate with one another. And again, I find that really fascinating. I actually think it's only intensified since then. Necessity being the mother of invention. If you want to talk to other oncologists right now, you can't really do that easily in person. So online is where you go. But there's a real need, I think, on Twitter with its constant flow of information to separate the signal from the noise. And hashtags are very, very helpful in doing that. And there we have to give credit where credit is due. So breast cancer advocates, patient advocates actually started what I think is the sort of foundational oncology social media hashtag in 2011 with hashtag BCSM, breast cancer social media. And from there, the floodgates opened. So shortly thereafter, brain tumor social media, which is presumably a much smaller group, but again, a very tight-knit community, followed with BTSM. And then after those organic examples, people, sometimes doctors, actually created hashtags deliberately so that we could have conversations congregating around certain topics. And so there was a rubric here, a rule to follow. So it had to be disease specific. The hashtag, of course, had to be short, it had to be unique or otherwise minimally used on Twitter to avoid confusion and the need for disambiguation. And it had to end in SM, which is a trigger to remember this is social media. This is online use that is visible to anybody. I think this is well known, but maybe not. You don't have to be on Twitter to see tweets. You can Google someone's tweet. So whatever you put on there is very, very literally public knowledge. The uptake in hashtags was fascinating because it was actually driven largely by patients and advocates. And here I think it's really crucial that we recognize the pioneering role that these voices played in establishing online oncology communities. If you look at this circular chart, the way that different stakeholders use hashtags is still predominantly used by patients and caregivers and advocates, more in some than by doctors or healthcare professionals. Okay, so this is a slide that gives me some pause because there's a somber reason for it that we'll get to. So the voice at this annual oncology meeting, ASCO, the proportion of voices, I should say, has shifted so that as the oncologists have gotten more vocal, unfortunately that comes at a cost. And that cost means that advocates have been heard less. And again, this is based on influencer data put through this third-party data aggregation group called Simpler. At 2019, a colleague of mine and I, Chadi Nabhan, recognized this, and we wrote a commentary about the ASCO meeting. And we said, it's really, really important to have caregivers and advocates' voices heard at these meetings. We underestimate their sophistication at our peril. And it's crucial that we listen to them to shape the kind of research that we're doing. And I'll give you this one example, and it may seem semantic, but I think there's a lot more to it than that. So at this meeting in 2019, there was an abstract, there was a presentation about patients, and I'm going to put this in quotes, who had failed whole brain radiation therapy. These are people with cancer in the brain. And we said at that point, and more importantly, the advocates said, hey, listen, that phrasing, that's not appropriate. We didn't fail anything. The treatment didn't work for these patients. And I know it seems like a small thing, but just turning that linguistic phrase on its head and realizing that actually, if anything, it's failing, it's the treatments that we're administering is so crucial in getting oncologists to accept responsibility for outcome, which in turn drives better research. And this is just to say that long before COVID, I think it was really, really important that patients and advocates get involved in meetings virtually. And you'd be surprised just how receptive oncologists are at these times. A lot of us are very online, especially with these hybrid models. We live half at the meeting and then half in this meta meeting that happens in the virtual space. We will listen to patients and advocates who engage us there. But every oncologist eventually will think about clinicaltrials.gov. This is the repository, as you may know, the federally run repository for all the trials that are run. And I have to say, I think in recent years, this interface, which is run by the government, as you can tell by that .gov suffix, has gotten a little bit friendlier to patients. You can actually put in, under that country tab, you can put in not just the United States, but where you live exactly and how far you're willing to travel for a clinical trial. I think this is wonderful. There are still some problems, though, on how well this information can inform any given patient's search. So this is a quote that I thought was very telling. This is a patient commenting on the redesigned clinicaltrials.gov, because again, it's recently gotten more user-friendly, believe it or not. They said, I always felt like I needed some advanced degree to figure out if I qualified or not. Some trial listings had conflicting information or were just very scientific, not average Joe information. And again, I think this person might be too self-effacing, but the readability analysis of the study purpose statements that you find on clinicaltrials.gov showed that on average, you needed to have at least 16 years of education. So obviously that's going to take you K through 12 and then into the college level. The average read level in the United States, though, is 7th to 8th grade. And that's not, again, to talk down to anybody that's listening to this talk. It's how do we be public-facing and comprehensible? And then, by that metric, only 12% of Americans are fully health literate, as judged by the Department of Health and Human Services. So we have a struggle, again, to make things understandable, but also complete. That's kind of the tension there. The other thing I wanted to bring up, it's actually a relatively recent development that the patient voice was even heard in clinical trials. So this is a really nice timeline, I think. of the history of clinical trials. I don't know how well this is known either, but arguably the first clinical trial, this is a really great story, was performed on a British naval vessel in 1753 by a Dr. James Lind. And what he did was he gave half the sailors citrus fruits, and he observed the other half. And the half that got citrus did better in terms of how they acquired or didn't scurvy. This is where the term limeys came from, because after then it became standard issue in the British Navy that you'd be given limes. And the vitamin C content would help you stave off scurvy. But look at this. So from 1753, it takes until 1978, so more than 200 years later, before we see the first quality of life measurement done in sort of objective and proactive fashion in a clinical study. So the patient voice, unfortunately, is relatively recent in terms of how it's being listened to methodologically in these studies. That said, we actually belong, I think, to the oncology community that might have the most ample precedent for studying quality of life. This is literally asking patients how they feel. So the first example I could find of this that I thought was robust is in 1986. This was a study of long-acting somatostatin analog, that might ring some bells, in arguably our most prestigious journal, the New England Journal of Medicine. And look at this. Dr. Qualls and his co-investigators, again, largely from the Mayo Clinic, just like Dr. Mortel, who I mentioned earlier, actually measured outcomes in terms of flushing and diarrhea. So the qualitative impact of this then new treatment. Now, they quantified that with changes in urine 5-HIAA, but it was also qualitative, and you can see there how those lined up. When somatulin, or lanreotide, became available as a somatostatin analog, we also looked at its impact on 5-HIAA and thus the symptom burden of disease. And then perhaps most recently, telotristat, which you might know as Zermelo, actually got its FDA indication specifically for symptom control, seeing this reduction in urine 5-HIAA, which then translated to a decrease in carcinoid diarrhea. So this study quantified, quite famously, the number of bowel movements carcinoid patients were having on a daily basis, and then documented the decrement in that frequency on this drug. So that quality of life benefit was actually the reason the drug got approved. So we belong, thankfully, to a research community that listens to our voices. So this is something I hate to say, and believe me, I hate to invoke this man, but this is, of course, Joseph Stalin. He said a single death is a tragedy, but a million deaths is a statistic. And what I'm getting at here is there are many, many numbers in oncology. I'm not defending oncologists, but you should know we're taught statistics, and we cite statistics in our practice, because if you come to me and ask me to predict your outcome, the best thing I can do is rely on patients that went before you, and that means invoking their range of experience, the range of their survival. Often I'll cite medians, the middle of a bell curve distribution. But to me, when I practice medicine, what I'm actually doing is I'm encountering their story one at a time. And this is something I wrote right after my diagnosis, when I said, when we critically assess the evidence that guides our management, we apply the rigor of statistics and discard underpowered studies as insufficiently robust. But each individual patient with cancer partakes in an ongoing, irreproducible experiment where n equals 1, by which I mean do not discount for one moment the importance of your own story. Your data point, for instance, should not get lost in aggregate with everyone else. And as has been said elsewhere at this conference, no two NET patients have an identical course. You are unique, and you should be recognized as such. So how do you go about telling a story and putting the pieces together? Well, I have a personal example here. So I had the Whipple procedure. Many of you may have had this also, to remove the head of my pancreas in 2017. And I found the Whipple very daunting, even as a doctor, to think about its anatomic complexity. I often say to my patients, this does to the upper abdomen what Picasso did to faces. You take the identifiable parts and you rearrange them. And so you start off with the anatomy there on the left, and you end up with the anatomy on the right. And it looks very, very different. Things are missing. Things are reattached. And the reason this particularly mattered to me to share my story is I'm a gastrointestinal oncologist. I have patients come to me all the time with pancreas cancer, and only 15% of them are eligible for the Whipple. And the reason for that is in the other 85%, these tumors have either already spread or they're so involved, so inextricably linked to the blood vessels around the pancreas that they can't be cut out. So in the remaining 15%, it's crucial that those people be offered surgery if they're eligible. And I have many, many people who've turned it down because they say, Doc, that surgery is too scary. It's too complicated. And I believe that monsters are more scary in the dark, meaning if I can shine a light on this procedure and I can show people step by step what it looks like, and if I can convince even one person who's eligible to then have the surgery, then I think I have done my part. So that's what I tried to do. And I used Twitter to do it. So again, don't try this at home, but this is how to chronicle your Whipple versus live tweeting. So I was extremely fortunate. So I work at a wonderful healthcare system in Utah called Intermountain Healthcare. It's the largest healthcare system here. We take care of patients in 6 states in the Intermountain West. And again, I'm very well resourced and I have a fantastic social media team. And so what they did was they followed me the entire day of my surgery. This is pre-op. I'm gathered there with my surgeon on the far right and my pastor next to him and my wonderful wife next to him. And again, they followed me all day. This is a moment I shared with my wife before surgery. This was actually one of my favorite pictures of us as a couple. And again, it showed the pre-op process. I'm trying to humanize here this journey. And then as a doctor, I have to say that it was very gratifying to see the engagement this had with traditional media. So I woke up from my surgery and I'd had 3 million impressions on Twitter, which was a staggering number. But then local news outlets, TV stations, and newspapers started picking up on this too. And my point there is this is non-binary. You can have both a social media presence and you can get attention from the more conventional journalists. This was an out-of-body experience for me. Thankfully for this part, I was completely under general anesthesia. You'll see there at the very bottom that my social media team took over my account, which led some of my friends to believe that I was being awoken from anesthesia to comment and then put back under. That's not how it went. But you can walk then step by step. I can walk then step by step through all the different parts of that procedure that day. And I now understand better what happened to me, and I hope that other people can too. I was not shy about the highs and the lows. The high there is on the left. That was the day I was discharged from the hospital. What you don't see in the middle is I was right back the next day, and then I was in for 5 weeks after that with a nasogastric tube, with a tube up my nose. And I did document the moment in my life where that was removed. It ranks right up there with my wedding day and the birth of my children in terms of things that we celebrate. And I wanted to show that this is not necessarily linear recovery, and that, yes, doctors can get sick too. And I think there's real power as patients in sharing both the good and the bad. The bad not to scare people, the bad actually to validate that, listen, it's very good to go into an operation with hope and intention, but you should also realize that complications happen, and there's a whole community that's willing to support you through that. I had incredible outreach during this process of getting over the Whipple, and it was just absolutely touching to log on. There's a lot of bad on social media. I would argue there is more good. So if I have come this far, it's by standing on the shoulder of giants. I'm going to recognize a few people here, one of whom you know very well. So Josh is the United States neuroendocrine tumor patient advocate par excellence. I don't know if there's anybody that does it quite like Josh. So he's on Twitter. He's deeply involved with NorCal CarciNET. As you may know, he hosts prtinfo.org and has helped countless people at this point navigate PRT, especially before it was available in the United States. So he's incredible. Internationally, though, there's other NET advocates I want to recognize. So Ronnie Allen is a Scot. That's my homeland. I'm from Scotland originally. He's incredible. And then there's another group led by Simon Robinson, and he's assisted by Rachel Gunter. That's the NET Cancer Foundation, nonprofit, operated largely out of the UK. Also amazing. And this is far from an exhaustive list, of course. But if you're looking to model your behavior after anybody, I would suggest starting with these people. It's really remarkable what they're able to do across a host of platforms, whether that's their own website, Twitter, Facebook, you name it. So this is the other sad reason that we're seeing the drop-off in advocate voices. We cannot take our advocates for granted. So this was, again, back in 2019. I showed you the shifting proportions. We saw the advocates dropping off. And in a very real sense, we were losing these people. These advocates were passing away. They were dying of their disease. Some of these patients cited here were breast cancer patients. I also see it in the lung cancer community. I see it in the NET community. And I'm sure it's tremendously upsetting when we see our kindred spirits pass on. But that also means we should listen to these voices with the fierce urgency of now. And with that, I couldn't give this talk to this group without paying honor to Giovanna. I only got the chance to meet her once in 2017, but I know that she was quite literally the foundational presence of your group. And I think she showed you already in her remarkable life how to embody advocacy in the best possible sense. So this is partly in her loving memory. So parting thoughts. We are mighty as a herd. So again, yes, one at a time, we're individual zebras, but together it's hard to ignore our collective presence. There's still tremendous meaning, though, even despite this collective strength in your story, and you should not be afraid to share it. That doesn't mean that you have to waive your confidentiality, but you should know that other people have done this and have found, again, more resonance and more support than they have found objection or pushback. It's important to find your community. I think you're probably there already. If you're watching this talk, you know about LACNETS, but there are other groups that aren't necessarily mutually exclusive and can also round out your experience. And this is a quote of mine, but one I completely believe in. The self-advocating patient is the most powerful force in medicine. Healthcare is very sophisticated. There are a lot of moving parts. I know in my own case, none of this would have happened to me if I had recognized that I had something wrong with me, and that was a neuroendocrine tumor syndrome. So please, 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 some of you have medical degrees. Frankly, you are an expert in your own body, and we ought to have the humility as doctors to recognize that. So please feel free to voice your concerns and speak your truth. And with that, I'll go ahead and close, and my contact information is there. Thank you very, very much.
Hello again, everyone. We're very fortunate today to have this amazing panel of NET advocates join us today from different parts of the country. As Josh said, it's a flat earth, so it's really convenient to have everyone together in the same space. I'm honored to introduce to you again Josh Mailman, NET advocate and president of NorCal CarciNET in the San Francisco Bay Area, Cindy Lovelace, co-founder and executive director of the Healing NET Foundation, and Dr. Mark Lewis, medical oncologist at Intermountain Healthcare in Utah. We will try to cover as many questions as possible, but we cannot get to all the questions as there are too many. And again, just a reminder that our programs are intended for educational purposes only and do not substitute for medical advice. We encourage you to talk to your own medical team about your own individual care or treatment plan. We also all have our own opinions, and these are our own opinions only. So, let's just get to some of these questions. And many of the questions revolve actually around your own journeys. As we know, you're all patients. And Josh just said, we're patients first. And we have to care for ourselves before caring for others. As we hear when we get on the plane flight, we have to put the oxygen mask on ourselves before others. So there's several questions that have come up today revolving around, really kind of seeking your opinion as fellow patients. One really common question that we hear come up quite frequently is, what are the best ways to communicate with family and friends about our own unique and rare cancer diagnosis? Especially because we often hear, but you look so good. Josh, let's start with you.
So, this is really going to be different for all of us. I know for me, one of the, I just recently wrote an article and had an interview where I talked about cancer journeys and really being able to express yourself so that you don't have to go about this alone. And that whether you reach out into a support group or whether you reach out to friends and family, that you should reach out and try to tell your story so that you can get it a little bit off your chest. I know for me, my first 6 months after I was diagnosed, I never ran into anyone who had anything that I had. And so at some point, because we all go to the doctor's office, right? And we're sitting in a waiting room and we all know we have some form of cancer, but we don't all look at each other's eyes. And it wasn't until I actually went to a support group at the Cancer Support Community, which was housing a neuroendocrine tumor support group, that I ever met anyone like myself. And it felt very empowering and very, well, empowering is the right word, to be able to discuss what you were going through and see how other people were going through the same type of issues. And it led me to, learn more about getting educated and going to conferences and learning about my disease, and ultimately led me to find better ways for treatment for what I had at the time.
Thanks, Josh. So support groups and storytelling are very helpful. Cindy, what about you? And then Mark, we'll let you follow up.
Well, I think Josh touched on the communication part, which the more you educate yourself, the more you're going to be more comfortable trying to explain this unique cancer to your family and friends. I think what has been helpful to me is to repeat myself often. I find that, even with closest relatives who, I've explained, what I have and what I'm doing several times, there's also the fact that it changes, right? And so my treatment can change. And so then I find myself explaining it all over again. So I try to have some patience with my family and friends, in that, everyone has kind of their own idea of what cancer is, or what a cancer diagnosis, or what a cancer patient looks like, right? And so when you don't fit that, what they're used to thinking of, then you have to do a little bit more explaining, and it can be exhausting, but it's important for them to really try to understand what it is that you are going through and what you're dealing with. That way they can be more supportive.
Yeah, thanks for that. Mark, what about you?
Yeah, I totally agree with Josh and Cindy there. I think that NET patients tend to subvert the stereotype of what a cancer patient should look like. And I'm a medical oncologist, so in my professional life, people come to me with a new diagnosis, and probably the most common question I get asked is, Dr. Lewis, can you cure me? And I know for so many of us, myself included, this is a chronic illness. It's not necessarily something that's going to go away. And in my case, I have a hereditary neuroendocrine tumor syndrome. So barring some sort of miraculous advance in gene therapy, I'm going to have this my whole life. And so I will sometimes use that as an example and reframe it for patients, who then in turn can reframe it for their friends and family, who I think are asking from a very well-meaning place. And then the externality of cancer is so interesting to me. My father, the reason I came into oncology in the first place, my dad went through chemo in the late 80s. And all of the stereotypes were true. He lost his hair, he was visibly nauseous, his immune system was decimated. And even outside of NETs, a lot of the cancers I treat don't leave a visible mark on the patient. And I think that's wonderful in the sense that they're not visually stigmatized, but it's tough when they hear, just as in the question here, oh, you look so good. And I think it's okay to explain that there are interior senses of disease and cancer and NETs that are not going to be readily perceptible to the outside individual. So I think that's okay. But otherwise, I think, again, it's well-intentioned. It does take communication, as my colleagues have said.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. And from all your own experiences, we all touched on support and the need for that. So let's talk a little bit more about that. What support systems might you recommend to support people physically, emotionally, spiritually, and relationally in their NETs journey? Josh, let's start with you again.
So, this is a huge question, right? The number, this, you almost drive a truck through this. But look, one of the really great things in here is the chance to go look at either palliative care and or work with wellness clinics or integrative oncology, somewhere where they can put, often put the whole body together. Because often what we hear from cancer patients is, my oncologist is treating my cancer, but he's not looking at me, or she's not looking at me, and I'm not getting the rest of this done. And that's a perfect place for working with integrative oncology, which I know that several centers around the country have, or working with palliative care, which looks more not, palliative care we used to think about as hospice, but now it's more about making sure everything's covered for you, your physical, emotional, and your well-being. And this is really, I think, things that have changed in the last 10 years since my first diagnosis. When I was in this watch and wait period, which I changed to watch and learn, was like, well, until we treat you, we might send you over across the street to integrative oncology, but once we need to treat you, we're going to bring you back and you won't do any of these things anymore. And I think that really has been a sea change. It really has shifted to there are these complementary things that we can do that manage the rest of you. Because really, and this was brought to me by one of some of my patients in our support group, was, pretty much the rest of your body's pretty good. You've got a bunch of cancer cells, but the majority of your body's actually doing pretty good, and you got to take care of the rest of your body. So that's a perfect reason to think through taking care of the rest of your body as best you can.
Thanks, Josh. Cindy, what do you have to add?
Yeah, I'm really glad that Josh mentioned palliative care, because it's a really important point that, that is for anyone who has a life-threatening disease. And cancer is a life-threatening disease. It is not hospice care. And so I think that, there's a lot of, by plugging into that, there's a lot of things that will be really helpful to you as you navigate this. And I think what really has helped me is, reaching out to others, support system. Well, there's support groups, and it may be difficult sometimes to find those that are particular to neuroendocrine. But I even found that, a group of cancer survivors that I just get together and have lunch with occasionally, it's just really helpful to, hear their stories and hear how they're coping with different things, because there are, taking care of ourselves physically and mentally that overlap into, what other cancer patients deal with. I, try to engage in yoga. Through Josh's group actually has a program, and I've done some on my own as well online. And I've also tried to connect with eating better, being more nutritionally conscious, and also taking time for myself. I started having regular massages, and that really was huge as far as reducing anxiety and, just giving me kind of a reset.
Thanks for sharing that and some specific self-care methods that people might use. Mark, what do you think?
So I think there's tremendous power in finding like-minded individuals. And these days, as we're doing right now, it's likely easier to do that online than it is in person, although some of us that live in more dense population centers, and certainly California has plenty of those, are maybe more likely to be living near people like them. When I was first diagnosed with my condition, which is rare, not as rare as Josh, he's got me beat there in terms of prevalence, but there was really no group I could find that supported my specific genetic condition, and so I co-founded one, and that's allowed us to aggregate online, and it's been enormously helpful to know that there are kindred spirits out there. The one caveat I think I would introduce is NET patients, perhaps more than most cancer patients, tend to have an incredibly individual course. And it's tempting, but I think ultimately misleading to compare yourself too closely to one other person. I'll actually use my own family as an example. I already mentioned my dad. He passed away at age 49, but our condition lacks what's called genotype-phenotype correlation, which means that even with exactly the same mutation, everyone's course, the way that the disease affects them throughout their life, is going to look different. And I would zoom out from that and say that's the case for members of support groups too. So support groups are wonderful. There's certainly a shared experience there. This is an incredibly self-advocating community. I say that, I guess, not with total objectivity because I'm a NET patient myself. I think talk about the journey people go through to arrive at the correct diagnosis, there's a lot of learning there that then can be shared with others and hopefully shorten the time it takes them to get to the right treatment and the right physicians. So I think the online community is not to be undervalued at all.
Thanks for that. And thanks for co-founding that support group. That's actually a perfect segue to my next question. What type of support groups are most helpful? And, this person who submitted the question noted that there are Facebook groups and other online groups, and of course, Zoom groups now, or in-person groups. So, of course, I'm a little biased. Let's go with you first, Josh.
So Lisa, I think the types of support groups that are more helpful are the ones that educate and don't try to give you medical advice. I think when people want to get you in private chat groups about what what you should be doing versus what you shouldn't be doing, or recommend one doctor versus another, or one treatment over another, that it's really time, whether that's in person or online, to really push the reset button. Because as Mark said, this is really an individual disease, and that what you're going to need is really an understanding of the disease, but not the specific thing that someone else is doing, because we're all different. And I think that's the hugely important part when it goes from education to, you need to see this doctor here, or do this treatment there, or don't do that treatment. That's probably the least helpful. And anything else that provides that level of support that helps educate you about your disease and lifts you up to learn more or to explore more, I think is the way to go. At the beginning of the pandemic, there was a great course that was taught by a Yale professor that you can still get online for free. It was, why your Facebook friends, why medical advice from your Facebook friends is all wrong. And it really was about, learning how to understand data, learning why getting medical information from the net may not always be the most preferred way. I mean, we can see that currently in what's going on in the pandemic, but certainly our own diseases are a microcosm of that as well.
Thanks for that, Josh. Cindy, what do you think?
Yeah, I get very concerned when I see online groups and people sharing extensive medical information about themselves and then asking everyone, what do you think? Or, what have you experienced? Or what did your doctor tell you about this? And that is just, that's not going down a good road. And plus, it's public information. So you're putting all this information out there about yourself that is just never really a good idea. So I think that, with the Facebook groups, I think it's a great place for support and a great place to feel like you're not alone, and to, let others know how you're feeling. But, when you get into very specific, medical situations or treatment decisions and so forth and so on, I go back to kind of what I said in my presentation. You have to build a relationship of trust with your doctor. And if you don't feel like you have that, then you really do need to consider another doctor. I mean, that communication is both ways, and it really is important for you to feel like that that you have the right team behind you.
Thanks, Cindy. Mark, what do you have to add?
Yeah, I guess I'll answer this from my bicameral mind. I'm a patient physician. I always live on the front part of that hyphenate, but as a patient, I completely agree with Josh. I think groups that are too prescriptive, that you absolutely have to do X or you absolutely have to go to Dr. Y, I think that's a red flag. It typically speaks to the fact that at least one person has had a rewarding experience following that course or seeing that physician, but it doesn't always have to be quite so black and white or set in stone. And then speaking as a physician, I have to tell you honestly, Facebook is where healthcare professionals fear to tread. Both the public discourse and then these private groups. And I say that very carefully because the organization that I co-moderate, one of our probably most active hives of discourse is a Facebook group. And it's been really fascinating to watch over the last several years as Facebook has endured sort of one scandal after another. There was Cambridge Analytica. There was a leak, or at least a plugin that revealed the details of BRCA patients who had shared details about their health, to Cindy's point, under the presumption of confidentiality. And then, even recently, there's been some concern about the platform and how data is used. Even with all that, the attrition of patients from these private groups that are centered around diseases is very, very small. Now, I could be proven wrong in the near future, but that speaks to me that the patients are finding, again, a kinship there that they're loath to get rid of. And until a platform comes along that is more ubiquitous and more trusted than Facebook, both, I think Facebook is still going to carry a lot of weight. It's kind of the elephant in the room when it comes to these groups. I agree with Josh, though. You really have to be careful in vetting the advice that you're given.
Okay, thank you. So, other than support and educational groups, what has been the biggest help to you, aside from your medical team, as you navigate the new diagnoses and treatments? Josh, let's start with you.
But I really do think the advent of technology and the ability to now see specialists or be able to communicate with each other via telehealth or other things that have gone so that your network or your ability to have a larger medical team has really helped. That's been one thing that has really changed in the last few years. And honestly, the other biggest help, back to the question before, support groups, right? It's without having that foundation of a support group and without being encouraged to learn more about my disease, I'm not sure. I'm pretty sure my path would not be the path that I'm on. My journey would be completely different. I would have never known about a conference in Toronto where I would have met some of the heavyweights of nuclear medicine, and I don't think I would have ever ended up in Europe myself. So my entire arc of my journey changed because of people who were helping me in a local support group.
Thanks for that, Josh. That really speaks highly to how the difference that it can make. Cindy, what do you have to add?
Yeah, I think building relationships with other NET patients and caregivers has been really, revolutionary for me. I mean, I feel like I have a good, solid medical team, but I think that, particularly when it comes to choosing next treatment steps or what that treatment is going to be like and understanding what it is before you embark on that, it's really important to speak to someone who has some experience with that and can maybe tell you, kind of what they've been through. And in that way, you can kind of prepare yourself, right? There's a number of times I've called Josh. I've called, other people in the NET community and just, kind of had a little powwow with them about, what was going on with me and, what was their experience and so forth and so on. And I think also, there's a lot of organizations that are doing a really good job with, providing really great educational conferences. And I try to take advantages of those as well, because you can always learn something. You're always learning, particularly with NET cancer.
We always are. Thanks for your insights and also the practical suggestions. Mark, what would you like to add to that?
Yeah, if I understand the question correctly, we're focused on the impact of the new diagnosis. And again, I'll speak here as an oncologist. So I often witness what I call the tinnitus of terror in that first visit, where someone is, you've confirmed the cancer diagnosis for them, and I can tell, you see it in their face. Everything else I say kind of becomes this low drone, and it doesn't quite get absorbed. And the reason I'm emphasizing that here is you almost always have time to make the decisions that you need to about your care. With very rare exceptions in a NET world, like say a very fast-growing neuroendocrine carcinoma, you have the relative luxury of exploring your options before you commit to a treatment or later on a new treatment. Another thing I would say here is I really want to empower patients to ask their physician sort of the therapeutic rationale for any given treatment decision. This is, again, not denigrating any of my colleagues in oncology. I sometimes hear in my field the term community oncologist used almost as an epithet. What that really means is an oncologist who's having to treat all or nearly every type of cancer, and it's not reasonable to expect most of those doctors to have a huge volume of NET patients. Ergo, you might be one of their only NET diagnoses in a given year. Hence, I actually think it's fine to ask, hey, why are we doing this treatment? Can we seek a second opinion? I often say, if your doctor says you can't seek a second opinion, that is a reason to seek a second opinion. And as Josh knows, I mean, in the NET community even, there are many patients who will seek out one expert or another authority and sometimes get divergent answers. And that goes to show you that there's not always a clear-cut, evidence-based sequence of care. But there is a lot of latitude for individualization of care. Go ahead, Josh.
But Mark, I want to piggyback to that, because I know there's a question on second opinions coming up, but it's even more important. What you said, I wanted to emphasize, is the rationale. Because a lot of people will go get a second opinion and say, okay, now I have two treatment opinions or two treatments. What do I do now? And it's understanding the rationale behind it and learning from that rationale that can help guide you understand how you want your own course. And I think that's even, thinking about it long term, we will make, if we're lucky, multiple treatment decisions. And understanding the rationales from those second opinions can help you along the way. It's not just a second opinion to get a different treatment vector, because there's lots. I mean, we can probably name off 7 right here. And so I can name off all 7, and which one do you want? It's the rationale behind it, and that once you understand the rationale, it helps you not just now, but in the future.
I was just going to say very briefly, this is from my physician side again, that the pendulum is swinging in medicine from the model of paternalism, which is we basically declare this is what you're going to do, towards, in its ideal form, shared decision making where it's something you agree upon together. But what I'm a little hesitant of is swinging too far in the other direction to what I call a la carte medicine, where your doctor gives you that menu of the 7 options Josh mentions and you just pick, which feels, I think, extremely precarious for the patient because there's some mix there of what the doctor and the patient are bringing. You have your embodied experience as the patient. No one knows your body better than you. Your physician has some level of expertise and experience. And I think it's finding that happy medium is what we're all working on together. Cindy, please go ahead.
Now, when you were talking about that initial diagnosis, I kind of addressed treatments, but I didn't really talk about the new diagnosis and that deer in the headlight look that you get. I think what's really important, it has been important for me, and I had to kind of learn this, is that I do try to bring my husband to as many appointments as it's reasonable to bring him to. Whoever your caregiver is, particularly in those initial days when you've been newly diagnosed, I mean, you are so shocked and you're not understanding the terminology initially. It takes time to get up to speed on all of that. So having someone there who can be a second set of ears is really, really important. And then you can go home and debrief. And also when you're considering treatment decisions, I think it's a good idea to involve your family in that if that's possible.
And it's totally fine to ask your doctor about recording conversations. It happens in my clinic all the time. You do want to ask permission. You don't want a wiretapping situation. But we do. What you have to realize is when we meet a new patient, we typically have some pre-specified block of time. You know this because that's the length of your appointment. And we got to get through everything. We got to get to know you. We have to verify your history. We have to convey the diagnosis. At some point, presumably, we're also examining you, and then we're prescribing treatment. That is a lot to fit into an hour. And it's a lot for us to have to explain, which means that we tend to go pretty fast. I'm talking fast right now. That's my default setting. So it is fine. It is absolutely fine to ask your doc, however, whichever format you want to use, to record that conversation for later digestion.
Yeah, thank you for all of that. And I'm glad you brought up caregivers or bringing a loved one or recording. As a caregiver myself, living with NET along with my husband for the last 6 years, what might you recommend that a caregiver can do to help their newly diagnosed loved one and also to find the support they themselves need? So there's kind of 2 parts to this question. I know that's a lot here. Josh, let's start with you.
From a patient perspective, right? I mean, look, we love the support that caregivers give us. We know we can be ornery and, in the moment, and depending on what other things are fluctuating with hormones, we could be really bitchy towards you and things like that. But that's just, both the stress and the disease talking. What I look at with our group is that caregivers need to find other caregivers to talk about, right? There are caregiver associations that you can use to work with other caregivers and just understand that, we're not necessarily at our best here, right? There's a lot of challenging things going on and we're being stressed and understand that if we lash out at you, it isn't because we don't like the help. We're going through a bunch of stuff. And, that's one of the reasons why both of our groups have separate caregiver sessions so that caregivers can talk to each other and help each other out on how to better do that. I mean, it may be different. There's, and this is back to second opinions and how to deal with treatments. Not everyone's a quarterback, right? Just because you got diagnosed doesn't mean you're the quarterback of your own team. And sometimes there are caregivers who are better quarterbacks and really can be the quarterback of the team. So really, it's a whole dynamic that is going to be different for everyone. But know that as patients, we really appreciate caregivers.
Thank you for saying that, Josh. Cindy, I wanted to see if you had anything else to add since you did bring up this topic.
I'll try to make it short. I think that the most important thing that a caregiver can do first is ask the patient what they need, how they really want to be helped, because sometimes very well-meaning caregivers can assume what the patient wants them to do and they just start doing. I think it's good to have that conversation first. And also think that caregiver support is important. to kind of piggyback off of what Josh said. I know that one time I was in a very small group setting. There were maybe 3 or 4 female patients like myself, and their spouses were there. And a few minutes into the conversation, one of the spouses said, "Hey, would it be okay if like us guys kind of went off and had a talk amongst ourselves and talked about being caregivers?" And we were like, "Sure, yes, that's a great idea." And so I think that's a real need.
Yeah, thank you for saying that. And I know that we offer, as Josh mentioned, a monthly caregiver-only support group. And it's not a time where we're information sharing and networking about treatments. It's really just to find that support that you're talking about. Mark, I want to see if you have anything else to add.
I'm going to answer this one as a doctor from 2 angles. Number one, as a doc, you always want to acknowledge the caregivers in the room, but I want those caregivers also to realize it's actually our ethical obligation to serve the patient and the patient first. In fact, just this week, I won't reveal any details, I had a caregiver very well meaning who was essentially overriding the patient's autonomy right in front of them. And I had to very gently redirect and say, hey, listen, I respect you as a person, but this patient is who I serve. And I think that that's a very delicate thing to say, but it is a necessary thing to say. And the second thing is, and this is across the cancer patient spectrum, it is so natural for a caregiver to want to nourish their loved one. But I'm a GI oncologist, I'm a NET specialist, and we all know in neuroendocrine tumors, there are a host of uncomfortable digestive issues that can come along with this disease type. And I cannot tell you how many times I see the most well-intentioned efforts to, quote, fatten someone up, not being met by the patient because they just don't feel like it. They have physical reasons, sometimes psychological reasons to reject that nutritional support. And I often see that being met as Josh said, oh, you're being antagonistic, you're being difficult. It's not the case. And so I think a little bit of understanding both ways, again, the well-meaning, but the also understandable rejection of those offers, I think that's really important.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And your perspective is very unique. I want to get back to that question that Josh kind of mentioned that we were going to get to about what's your opinion about second opinions. So Josh, let's kind of start with you with this one.
Well, I mean, kind of what Mark said before as well is if you have a doc who won't allow you to get second opinion, then you need another doc as your first opinion. And that goes around. And honestly, one of the things, I did a series of speaking engagements called Speaking Up, where we went through 14 different cities. And the one thing that we learned is that most people are afraid that it will upset their doctor to ask for a second opinion. And to a T, every doctor that we had on our Speaking Up panel was like, no, we're good with that. You can even ask us who we think would provide a good second opinion or who might provide a different idea of what an opinion might be. And so I really think it's important to go do that and at least once in your journey and understand how that might work and how that might help you.
Thanks for that. Cindy, what about you?
Yeah, I just echo exactly what Josh said. I mean, if someone gets upset at the idea that you are asking for a second opinion, and what Mark said as well, you need to move on. That's just the way it goes. I do want to define second opinion as, I think Josh talked about this a little bit earlier, about like you get 2 different treatment options and you're trying to make the decision on which one is right or whatever. I also see a tendency by some patients to go what I call doctor hopping. And so to me, a second opinion is not going around until you get the answer you want. So you've already kind of got in your head what you really want the answer to be, and you're just trying to find the doctor that will tell you the one that you want. That is not seeking a second opinion.
Thank you for clarifying. Mark, what about you?
Yeah, I think you guys are way too concerned with doctors' feelings, honestly. I mean, I know we all have massive, fragile egos, but no, honestly, and I think Josh in particular knows this, like the NET community of physicians is actually really tight-knit. It doesn't mean we all agree on everything. I know we don't. But as he said earlier, the real thing is if you encounter a divergence of opinion, I don't think you've gone far enough. I think you need to go the next step and understand why is it different? Why is one physician saying one thing and the other saying something that's, again, different than that? And then getting the therapeutic rationale and really then reconciling which one feels right for you. I seldom think there is a single right answer. One, again, of the beautiful things about the longitudinal disease course of NETs is that there tend to be multiple nodes, multiple forks in the road. It's seldom the case that one treatment will preclude future lines of therapy. That sometimes happens. And so again, maybe the other question to ask is, by doing X, am I prohibiting myself from Y and Z down the line? I think it's appropriate for most of us to take a very long view. And then lastly, I'll say, you can be transparent with your doctor. I have to tell you, I'm almost amused sometimes when one of my colleagues in the NET community calls me and it's like, hey, I'm seeing XYZ in my office, and I had no idea they were going and seeking that. It doesn't bother me. But frankly, I believe in transparency. And, if you want a second opinion, just ask. And like was said, I'll be happy to recommend people. So I think this whole notion that you have to protect us or you have to be quiet about it, I would push back on that. This is your body. It's your decision what happens to it.
Thanks
But
for
also
saying that.
point out that even inside of second opinions, where we're being treated, right? There's a multidisciplinary team that is going to be reviewing, which is a bunch of second opinions. And from what little I do know about the NET community doctors, but I know a fair lot, you guys talk about complex cases with each other out of course a habit, and you share. And so even if there's places that you may not be able to get it because of insurance or otherwise, know that your docs are talking to each other and are talking, inside their own groups about the cases, and you can ask about what the thoughts were there, and do talk to other people as well.
Very briefly, because I know we're short on time. There are tumor boards, which are these multidisciplinary conferences that Josh is referring to. They actually happen at my institution every week. I run them. And I tell my patients overtly when I'm presenting their case, not because I want them to feel like their privacy is being violated, because we strip away all the confidential information, but to tell them that's a built-in second and third and fourth opinion from surgeons and radiologists and interventional radiologists and radiation oncologists and nuclear medicine. So I think understanding some of these necessarily hidden mechanics of healthcare can actually be reassuring. It's not just one person adjudicating your care. Not everything hinges on their one opinion.
Thank you for that.
Right. I really agree with the multidisciplinary teams. That's an excellent point, because that is getting several opinions. You're getting your true bang for the buck, as they say.
Well, I'd love to hear also, I guess, there's a lot that happens, and we're talking about the shock of the initial diagnosis. What have been some of the surprise blessings or silver lining in your journey? Josh, let's start with you.
Looking at 15 years ago, would I have thought that I'd be representing all patients across all diseases as the patient right advocate for the Nuclear Regulatory Commission? No chance. I didn't even know the Nuclear Regulatory Commission existed. And so if you look at these surprise blessings, or, my journey into advocacy and working in places that have improved the lives of patients, not only with NETs, but of other diseases, and changing regulations and changing how things get paid and working inside that, I would be shocked. And so that's one of those silver blessings, and the other, or surprise blessings or silver linings, and the other was, look, I'm sitting here across from three great people that I would not have known without this disease. And this is the silver lining, right? I work in global health. I know I have friends across the planet that I'm missing now that we're still in this flat Earth or flat screen Earth that we have in front of us. But I would have never imagined, traveling to India to go to a conference and being greeted by several doctors who know my work. It's unfathomable that this would happen. And so if you look at surprises and silver linings, there you go. It wasn't that I didn't have a bad profession to start out with and doing really great in the tech world, but this has been different.
Well, we're glad to meet you too, Josh. Cindy, what do you think?
Well, ditto to everything Josh said, and I think that I feel like I've received more than I've given. I was in a communications career, but it was, I didn't necessarily feel like what I was doing was, personally affirming, the good in me, if you will. But, I feel like more blessings have come back to me as a result of just reaching out, sharing my story, and trying to help others. The relationships that I have built have been like none other.
Yeah, you bring up relationships a lot. It really is about community. And what about you, Mark?
Yeah, I might have a slightly different take. I'm in an interesting position where the more I have been willing to share my net experience, the more net patients come to me. It's like this beautiful feedback loop. And the reason I find that so rewarding professionally is I get to see, again, this incredibly rich diversity of experience. And for those people that are doing great, that obviously gives me a lot of hope. For the people that aren't doing so well, it inspires me to think about, well, how can I do one small part, especially in regards to research and improving their outcome. And I'll say this, I think there is a very proud precedent in net research in particular to focus on quality of life. Quality of life study is relatively late to the game in cancer research as a whole. For far too long, and I get it, it was measurable, oncologists were focused on survival, a very hard endpoint, perhaps the most black and white metric. But going back to the 1980s, there are net physicians who are genuinely invested in quality of life as an outcome for our community. And I'm reminded of that all the time when I see people. I am actually usually not so worried about my patients' longevity with nets as I am worried about their quality of life. And I think, again, it's a beautiful thing that I get to see that and try to help with that.
Mark's what Mark said reminded me of one time I got a call from a patient out of the blue that just found me randomly through Google or whatever. And she had just received a diagnosis, and she was about to be a new grandmother. And I have 5 grandchildren, and she was crying because she really thought that her diagnosis was going to prevent her from ever seeing her grandchild for the first time. And after we talked it through, I realized that she didn't have, she had a slow-growing cancer. And so the more we talked, the more she kind of calmed down and understood that maybe, just maybe, she was going to get to see that grandchild after all. So that's the kind of conversations that are true blessings.
Yeah. And all of you are passing it on, paying it forward in many ways. So, many people don't have a lot of time or energy. So what are some small ways that I might be able to use my voice to make a difference in the net community? So Josh, let's go with you first.
So there are lots of different ways that you can make differences, whether it's donating something to any of the support communities that are going on research, or funding young investigators to learn more about this disease and to stay in that disease. I mean, we talked a lot about this in my session of things that you can do to do this. So that's one way you can help fund. You can advocate on behalf of things like telemedicine, which, talking to your senator or House representatives. There are things that you can do inside of advocating for all patients, whether it's through ASCO, Conquer Cancer Group, or others, where you can lend a simple letter writing to your representative that might change how people are cared for. But really, even just asking, we've got Mark here right below me, who, ask your doc, say, how can I help? I mean, that's what got me in trouble. I asked, how can I help? And here I am. But you can say, I have a little time. Is there something I can do at this center that might help other patients? Is there something I can do in my community that might help? So ask. And when you ask, how can I help, you'll usually get an answer.
Yeah, thank you for that. I'm sure they can ask any of us and we can give them an answer.
Yes. Yeah.
Cindy, let's go to you next, and then
yeah, I think just reaching out to any of the net organizations, and asking that question of how I can help. I mean, there's going to be something that can fit your skill set or what you're comfortable doing. And the question specifically says ways I can use my voice. And so a long time ago, someone asked me, how I got started in what was a radio career at the time. And I was actually a very shy introvert all through high school and most of my college days. So it was kind of surprising, I guess, to folks that I ended up doing what I did. And I said, I just kind of decided I just needed to just jump in and do it. And so by just sharing your story, even if it's just with a few people, and then maybe it's more people, but just being willing to share, your journey. And I'm not talking about specific medical information, but just what you've done to cope, what you've done to find joy, what you've done to ensure a quality of life. That can be really, really helpful to the next person.
Thank you for sharing. And Mark, what do you think?
Yeah, I would say actually there's no pressure to be as demonstrative as we've been. I mean, I think we've sort of been cherry-picked for this presentation because we're willing to share. I would actually argue it starts in your doctor's office because, again, I think it's important to remember that you may be one of the only NET patients in an oncologist practice at any given time. And I say that, again, not to scare people or put too much pressure on them, but really to be honest with your doctor about your experience and perhaps if you're willing to say, hey, listen, I'm happy to share my experience with other patients. I got to be clear about something. Confidentiality may actually be the most sacrosanct thing in medicine. There are very few ways a doctor can lose their job faster than disclosing your personal health information. So that's something that you have to waive. But if you're willing to talk to their patients, just that beautiful example Cindy gave of talking to a would-be grandmother and giving her some reassurance, I mean, that goes such a long way. It doesn't have to be giving a talk on a podium or even being vocal in an online support group. These are all wonderful things. It can really be that person-to-person connection even with your doctor.
Thank you for sharing all these different ways people can help. I mean, there's a lot of questions and I could keep talking to you guys for a long time and we've already gone long. Let's just end with this final question. What last words of hope or encouragement might you offer to those in the community? Josh, let's start with you first.
So if we look at this, I'm now going on to my 15th year, and every year there are improvements in our care. There are new treatments that are coming up. There are things that give us hope and give us pause that, whether we ever cure this is one thing, but that the ability to live with this as a chronic disease keeps getting better and better, and we keep having more quantity of life and new treatments that are coming out. And I think that's, the hope or encouragement is that we've got a lot of really dedicated medical professionals and that are working on this. And I always think, if you get caught in the online group, you might think there are only 6 doctors who work on this on the planet. And there really isn't. There are hundreds, and under those hundreds are another layer of people who are doing research. And under those, there are so many more people who are interested in this disease that it's really encouraging. I'm going to go back to 2018, where I was at an ESMO conference where there were 2 NET drugs that were being presented at ESMO, which is this huge conference, a European conference. And the conference room is like, I don't know, 1,000, 1,500 people big. And 2 of the presentations were on neuroendocrine tumor. It was Lutathera, and I'm trying to figure out, I can't remember what the other one was at the time, but there were 2 drugs being presented and then a third drug. The 2 neuroendocrine drugs were presented first. After that was done, there were hundreds upon hundreds of people who were streaming out. They didn't care about the third drug. It was the first 2. There was the neuroendocrine tumor drugs that's how deep this goes. That this isn't, if the reason I really did start to advocate on behalf of neuroendocrine tumors was, or to let patients know about the work I do, is it runs really deep. The pyramid, the iceberg, we see the tip, and you may see 5 doctors or 6 doctors, but that tip of the iceberg, the base is so huge that it's really encouraging.
That is really encouraging, Josh. Thanks for sharing. Cindy, what words do you have?
Yeah, I think to kind of piggyback on that, just the younger doctors who are getting into the field, they're there. And I just got an email the other day from NANETS, which is the healthcare expert society for neuroendocrine, and they were sharing the young investigators and just looking at those faces, the diversity as well as the youth. I mean, that was huge. And, that gives a lot of hope to patients that, even as those tried and true net experts that they've heard the names of for years and years, even as they approach, retirement, be encouraged that there are younger doctors. There are people who are, really investing in this and are finding it interesting and challenging. I recently transferred, a new member of my team to one of those younger up and coming physicians. And, I think that what he lacks in experience, he has in just wanting to find the answers. And he's just so smart and so up on all the latest research. There's lots of research going on. And I will tell a quick conference story like Josh just did. For years, I've attended a conference, ASCO GI. And they deal with, all of the diseases that can affect your GI system. But I have noticed over the years more and more posters and sessions and such that are on neuroendocrine. So it's very, very encouraging and very hopeful to see that.
Thank you for that. The young investigators and the youth, the younger physicians certainly are bringing passion to the field. Mark, what are your final words and thoughts?
Yeah, I think I'll actually synthesize what Josh and Cindy said. In fact, there's a slide I used in some of my talks that I think I stole from Josh or maybe borrowed, which shows progress over time. And Josh, I think in turn you might have adapted this from Dr. Matt Kulke, but basically the time horizon goes back about 40 years. And the x-axis of how that time has progressed is not linear because all of a sudden it gets very, very compressed. And in the last decade in particular, there are just advances that are happening faster and faster. And it's happening because there is this critical mass now, this brain trust of researchers. Also, to be honest, I think there's real interest in a lot of the pharmaceutical industry now in helping NET patients, which is wonderful. And I think the realization that the prevalence of NETs, the number of us who are living with this disease is growing, means that a drug has more of a target audience, more of a population it can help, which again is going to fuel more research. So it is getting better all the time. I have so many more tools now to help my patients than I did when I started my fellowship. I will not say we're spoiled for choice. We still need more options. But really now it's a matter of sequencing, not a matter of, oh, there's only one thing that we can do.
Thank you so much. This has been a lot of fun. And as an advocate, as the program director for LACNETS, as a caregiver myself, I'm just deeply grateful for all that all three of you are doing for the NET community. Thank you so much for all you do. I'm very inspired by all of you. I hope to be like you when I grow up. And I just wanted to thank all of you for, really, using your voice, the advocacy, the work that you're doing, making a difference one life at a time or one committee at a time, and really making an impact for all of us. Thank you for that. And thanks for joining me today.
Thank you for asking.
Now back to you in the studio, Rich.
Thank you, Lisa. Be sure you're following LACNETS on social media. We have Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Stay up to date on upcoming events and NET news. As Lisa mentioned in the beginning of today's symposium, we invite you to take the pledge and join us for our NET Cancer Day 3-month challenge. To take the pledge and learn more about the challenge, go to www.lacnets.org/challenge. Now passing it back to you, Lisa.
Thanks, Lindsey. As Dr. Mark Lewis mentioned in his presentation, we remember our founder and executive director emeritus, Giovanna Joyson Basie, whose birthday was yesterday. Birthdays are celebrations, and I believe that Giovanna would say that today is a celebration of community and connection. Giovanna would want you to know that you're not alone. And to this end, we offer many programs and resources, including our weekly NET support group, a dedicated caregiver-only support group, NET Vitals, which is a downloadable patient-physician communication tool to help you prepare for your medical appointments, and health coaching, available to NET patients or caregivers. We encourage you to go to our website, lacnets.org, to find out more information about our programs, view resources, read blogs, take NET quizzes, and much more. The virtual world has definitely made it easier to access many NET educational programs like today's webinar, and it's also easier to join a support group since many are meeting virtually and open to people across the country. There's many support groups out there that are available for you to connect with, and if you need help getting connected, feel free to reach out to us and we can help. We want you to know that you are not alone. LACNETS recently launched a new podcast featuring local net experts who answer the top 10 questions in their field. We hope you take a listen, and we'll be releasing one episode every month, so stay tuned for more. Please also join us for our upcoming monthly webinars. Next month, we look forward to hearing from amazing TEDx speaker and friend, Chaplain Michael Echelon, who will share an inspirational talk titled Riding the Cancer Wave, Spiritually Speaking. We'll also be hearing a patient's story. In January 2022, Dr. Pamela Kuntz from Yale University will share the latest updates in net cancer research in her talk, What's New with NETs? What's on the Horizon? In February, Dr. Heidi Del Rivera from the NIH will give an update on pheochromocytoma and paraganglioma, focusing on advanced metastatic disease. This presentation is also available to view in Spanish on our YouTube channel. In March, Dr. Aman Chauhan from the University of Kentucky Marquis Cancer Center will address the special neuroendocrine carcinoma population with his presentation titled Updates in High-Grade Neuroendocrine Cancers. If you registered for today's webinar, you will be receiving an email to fill out a survey. We would really appreciate it if you take the time to fill it out, as the survey results help us with our fundraising and support and planning for future events. Thanks again to our amazing NET advocates who presented today for all you do to advocate on behalf of the whole community and inspiring all of us today. Thank you to Rich at TVP Live, and thanks to all of you for joining us today. Goodbye and see you next month.
Bye.